Hey there Unmaskers, welcome to my channel Unmask It Now. Thanks for tuning in today. In today's video, we'll explore how to create a self-managed Active Directory on Amazon EC2. The agenda of today's video includes looking into the network architecture of the setup, the port requirements for the Bastion host, the Active Directory or AD port requirements, and the demo covers these steps. We'll first install Active Directory domain services, DNS feature, and also the AD management tools. We'll configure a primary domain controller or DC for the domain, corp.local in our case. We'll add another domain controller or DC for that domain, which is corp.local. We'll then log into the DCs as a domain administrator. And finally, we'll review the setup. Let's take a look at the network architecture for this design. As per the AWS best practices for the VPC design, we will have two public subnets and two private subnets in two different availability zones for high availability. The Bastion host or the jump server is launched in the public subnet, and it is used to RDP to instances launched in the private subnet. We will then launch two instances in the private subnet, one in each AZ for high availability. We will then configure these instances to function as domain controllers and DNS servers, that is DC01 and DC02, for our self-managed Active Directory domain. In this case, it's corp.local. The domain controller instances will have a security group associated with them that allows the ports necessary for Active Directory communication. It also allows RDP traffic from the Bastion server security group. We will also have the Bastion server that's attached with a security group that allows RDP traffic from the public IP of our local workstation. Let's now review security groups for the Bastion host instance. The Bastion host security group, which is named as Bastion-SG, has the inbound and outbound rules that you can see on the screen. The Bastion host security groups allows inbound RDP traffic on TCP port 3389 from the public IP of our workstation. And the Bastion security group has outbound rules to allow all traffic to any source. Coming to the security group that will be attached to the Active Directory domain controller instances, DC01 and DC02. We have referred to the Microsoft documentation to prepare the security group rules required by Active Directory service that will be attached to both the domain controllers. The name of the security group here is ADDC-SG. Based on that, you can see that we've prepared the inbound rules as needed for the Active Directory security group. We are allowing Active Directory traffic from all instances within the VPC, and we are allowing RDP traffic from the Bastion host. As for the outbound rules, the Active Directory domain controller security group will allow all traffic outbound to any source. Here is the link for the Active Directory port requirements that's defined by Microsoft. I will also link this document in the description below. Let's now switch over to the demo. As part of this demo, we'll be using Powershell commands to perform most of the instructions that are given in the demo. However, you can substitute them by using the UI to perform the same actions. I'm currently logged into the Sydney region of my AWS account as the administrator user Wiz. Per the network architectures diagram that we saw previously, I've already created a VPC with two public and private subnets. I've launched the Bastion host instance, as you see here, in one of the public subnets. I've then launched the DC01 instance in one of the private subnets, and I've then launched the DC02 instance in the other private subnet. Let's take a look at the security group for the Bastion host server first. So clicking on the security group, I'm going to open it here. You can see that the Bastion host security group has one inbound rule to allow RDP traffic on port TCP 3389 from the public IP of my local workstation. And I've allowed all traffic in the outbound rules to any source. Let me switch back to the instances console and select the DC01 instance. The security group attached to both DC01 and DC02 is the same. So let me open the security group in a new tab. You can see that for the inbound rules, I have allowed all the required ports for Active Directory port communication, which is the same as that was reflected in the table previously. As for the outbound rules, I have allowed all traffic to any source. So let me close these two tabs and come back to the instances page. So let me switch over to the Bastion host RDP session. So let me click on command prompt on this session. And you can see that the host name of this machine is Bastion host. I've renamed the Windows machine as Bastion host. I've also installed a Remote Desktop Connection Manager, RDC man, on the Bastion host server so that I can use that application to RDP to DC01 and DC02 instances. I've also renamed the EC2 instances as DC01 and DC02 respectively. So let me quickly show that. Within the PowerShell ISC session, let me type the command hostname. And you can see that this server is renamed as DC01. And let me switch over to the RDP session for the other machine. And let me type in the same command hostname. And you can see that I've renamed this instance as DC02. Let me flip back to the DC01 session. DC01 will be the primary domain controller for the Active Directory domain, and DC02 will be the additional domain controller for our Active Directory domain. In this example, our domain name will be corp.local. So let me first get the instructions to install the Active Directory domain services feature on this primary domain controller. For all the commands that I will be using in this demo, I will add a GitHub link in the description below. Before we can configure the DC01 instance as a primary domain controller, we first need to install the Active Directory domain services feature. So before we perform that, let me just quickly run the command to verify that the feature does not exist. So to do that, let me paste the command here, which says get-windows feature, and the name of the feature is AD domain services. So let me quickly run this command. You can see that the Active Directory domain services feature is available, but it is not installed as it is not checked here. So let's go ahead and install the Active Directory domain services feature. In order to do that, I will paste this command. That is install-windows feature, AD domain services, and I will also include the management tools during the installation. So let me go ahead and click on enter. It will take a couple of minutes to install the feature. While the feature is installing, let me go ahead and perform the same instructions on the DC02 instance as well. Switching over to DC02 instance, let's first run the command to verify that the feature is not already installed. You can see that the feature is available but not installed, so let's proceed to run the installer. Flipping back to the DC01 instance, I can see that the installation has completed. The installation does not require a restart, as you can see that the restart needed is no. Let's verify if the feature has been installed by running the command to get the Windows feature. This time you can see that the Active Directory domain services feature, the installed state reports is installed, and you have an X right in front of it, which confirms that the installation has completed on this instance. Let's flip over to the DC02 instance and verify the same. We can see that the installation is completed, and let's run the command to verify the installation. You can see that the installation has succeeded as the installed state now reports installed on the DC02 instance as well. Now that the Active Directory domain services feature is installed on both the DC01 and DC02 instances, let's proceed to create an AD forest and configure the DC01 instance as our primary domain controller for our domain corp.local. So let me flip over to the DC01 instance and copy across the command. So to configure the DC01 instance as a primary domain controller, we first need to create an AD forest for the domain corp.local. And while we're doing that, we'll also install the DNS server service on the instance. So let me go ahead and click on run. It will prompt you for the safe mode or the DSRM administrator password. This is different from the domain administrator password, and this is only used in case of AD recovery. Now that I've entered the safe mode administrator password, it will prompt me to click on yes to continue with the operation. So I'm going to click on yes to all. You may notice a couple of warnings that may appear during the installation or configuration of the Active Directory forest. You can ignore these warnings. Once the configuration is completed, you will be prompted to restart the machine. So the machine is now restarting. I will give it a couple of minutes to reboot. I've given it a couple of minutes for the restart to complete post Active Directory domain services configuration. We will now log into the DC01 instance as the domain administrator. So to do so, I'm going to right click on the properties of the DC01 server. And in the login credentials, I'm going to change the username from the default administrator to the domain administrator. So it will be prefixed with the NetBIOS name for the domain In our case, since the domain name is corp.local, the NetBIOS name by default is corp, and the password for the domain administrator will be the same as the password that was there for the default administrator, as during the Active Directory services configuration process, the default administrator will be promoted as the domain administrator. Now that that's done, I'm going to click on OK and then attempt to connect to the DC01 instance. You can see that in the RDP certificate, the name of the computer is now dc01.corp.local. So I'm going to go ahead and click on yes. So I'm now connected to the DC01 instance as the domain administrator, and I've launched the Powershell ISC session. So let's run the command who am I to verify the user that we are logged in as. You can see that the user is the domain administrator as expected. Next, let's run the command ipconfig/all. So I'm going to select the command and selectively only run ipconfig/all. You can see that the hostname of the machine is DC01 and the primary suffix is corp.local. So this confirms that the machine is joined to the domain corp.local. You can also see that the DNS servers are configured as ::1 for IPv6 and 127.0.0.1, which is a local host, which is nothing but itself, because we've also installed the DNS server service while configuring this machine as a domain controller. Let me also run the command sysdm.cpl. This will verify that the machine is joined to the domain. You can see that the fully qualified domain name for this machine is dc01.corp.local and the domain is corp.local. To confirm that the Active Directory domain services is running, I'm going to run this command. Get-service-name ntds, which is the name for the Active Directory domain services. You can see that the status is running. Let's now launch one of the management tools for Active Directory. So I'm going to run dsa.msc. And this should open the Active Directory users and computers console. You can now see that our domain name is corp.local. You can see the users container, the computers, as well as the domain controllers container. You can see that the DC01 is registered as a domain controller for this domain. I also want to launch the DNS server management service on this machine. To do so, I'm going to run this command. You can see that the DC01 server also acts as a DNS server, and in the forward lookup zones, we do see a forward lookup zone for the corp.local domain. We also see that there is a record for DC01, which is a host A record with its primary private IP address. With this, we complete the configuration of DC01 as the primary domain controller for the corp.local domain. Let's now switch over to the DC02 instance, and we will now configure DC02 as an additional domain controller for the domain. Before we do that, we first need to configure the DNS IP address of DC02 to point to the primary domain controller, that is DC01. So we'll run the first command here, which is get-net IP interface to get the interface index of our Elastic Network adapter. So let me run this command. You can see that the interface index of Ethernet 2 is 7. So we'll use that to replace it in the second command and then provide the IP address of DC01. This command is used to set the DNS server address where we provide the interface index and the server address, which is the IP address of DC01. So let me go ahead and run this command. And now that that's set, I will go ahead and run the commands to configure this instance as an additional domain controller for our domain. So we'll use these commands. So I've specified the domain name, which is corp.local, and we'll use the credentials of the domain user, which is corp/administrator, and we'll provide the hash arguments to the command install-adds domain controller with the hash arguments carrying the credentials of our domain administrator, the domain name, and we'll also install the DNS server role. So let me select these commands and go ahead to run that. You can see that we are prompted for the credentials of our domain administrator. That's corp/administrator. So I'm going to provide password. We'll also be prompted for the DSRM or the safe mode administrator password. This is not the same as the domain administrator, but will be used for the purpose of AD recovery. So let me provide the password here and confirm the same password. And in order to continue with this operation, I'm going to click on yes to all. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes for the installation of the domain controller to continue. You may notice a couple of warnings and you can go through these warnings. However, there's no action that you need to take and you're safe to ignore them. Once the installation is completed, you'll be prompted to sign out and the machine will restart if you don't provide any user input. I've now given it a couple of minutes. Before we can log into DC02, we do need to update the credentials for the RDP login now that DC02 is the additional domain controller for the domain. So I'm going to right click on DC02, click on properties, go to login credentials, and I'm now going to give the username as the domain administrator user. And for the password, I will use the password that we reset for the domain administrator. I'm going to connect to DC02. You can see that the name of the remote computer and the RDP certificate is dc02.corp.local, which confirms that the machine is joined to the domain. So let me click on yes. While we're waiting on that, I'm going to disconnect the DC01 server as well. Change the login credentials for DC01 to the password that we reset. And then connect back to DC01. So let me flip back to DC02. I've now logged into the DC02 and I've launched the Windows Partial IC session. So let's quickly run a couple of commands to verify the configuration of the domain controller. So I'm first going to run who am I. You can see that I'm logged in as the domain administrator. I'm then going to run ipconfig/all. You can see that the hostname is DC02 and it has a primary suffix for corp.local, which confirms that the machine is joined to the domain and it has the primary suffix with the domain name. We can also see that the DNS servers is itself, and then the primary server is 10.0.133.152, which is the DC01 IP address. I'm also going to run sysdm.cpl. You can see that the fully qualified domain name is dc02.corp.local and the domain name is corp.local. I'm then going to use this command to confirm that the Active Directory domain services service is running on this instance. You can see that the Active Directory domain services, which is NTDS, is running on this instance. I'm then going to use this command, dsa.msc, so that I can launch the Active Directory users and computers console in the domain. And you can see it's same as that of the DC01 instance. I'm also going to launch the DNS management console. And you can see that the DC02 also functions as a DNS server and has a forward lookup zone for the domain, that's corp.local, with both the DC01 and DC02 host A records pointing to its corresponding IP addresses. It is also a best practice on domain controllers to configure the primary DNS server as itself and the secondary DNS server pointing to the other domain controller. So let's quickly configure that on both DC01 and DC02. So let me flip over to the DC01 console and use this command to set the DNS client IP addresses. So you need to configure the primary DNS server as its own IP address, and the secondary DNS server would be the DC02 IP address. So let me go ahead and quickly grab the IP address of DC01 and then grab the IP address of DC02 and then select and run this command. I missed the IF index, so I'm going to put the IF index as 7, which we saw previously, and then I'm going to run the command. Once the command is run, I'm going to run ipconfig/all to verify the DNS server configuration. So you can see on DC01, the primary DNS server is its own IP address and the secondary DNS server is DC02. Let's use the same command on the DC02, but flip the IP address configuration. So on DC02, the primary IP address would be its own IP address and the secondary IP address would be the DC01 IP address. So I'm going to select that and then click on run. And to verify that, I'm going to run ipconfig/all. And you can see that the configuration has now been updated. This concludes how to configure Amazon EC2 instances as domain controllers for a self-managed Active Directory domain. And we did that for DC01 as the primary domain controller. And we also added an additional domain controller, DC02, to the domain. Thanks for watching. For more such content, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Unmask It Now. Until next time.